Well, thank you very much indeed for your attention. And after that very interesting discussion with the Prime Minister, we're now going to drill down more into some of the key questions that we were discussing, and in particular, some of the challenges and some of the questions that overseas allies of Ukraine are now asking about the direction of the political environment inside Ukraine, the question of corruption, the question of the energy supplies and whether they will or will not be even more degraded over the winter, and also the question of how and why the economy is performing better than some had expected. We have a terrific group to talk about this. We've got Ruslan Stefanchuk, who is the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. A man who's been busy herding cats in a very challenging time. We have Andriy Pyshnyy, who is the governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. And an institution that's been done a really quite remarkable job of maintaining the value of the currency, keeping inflation under control and keeping the economy performing much better than many outsiders, including myself, had expected or feared. So we're going to be asking him how and why the Central Bank of Ukraine has managed to do that. And we've also got Gillian Galushchenko, who's the Minister of Energy of Ukraine, who's going to be talking to us about whether Ukraine can really keep the lights on this winter, and if not, what that means. We've also got in the audience, I'm going to be drawing on later on, Anastasiya Radina, who's the head of the Anti-Corruption Committee of Parliament, who I'll be asking some questions about whether or not the corruption situation is really improving or not. So perhaps we can start with the good news, which is the work that Andriy Pyshnyy has been doing at the Central Bank of Ukraine in terms of keeping the currency stable and keeping inflation down. The history of wartime economies, for the most part, is absolutely dreadful in terms of the currency and economy. You normally have hyperinflation and currency collapse in war. That has not happened in Ukraine. How and why have you managed to keep the economy more or less on track? And do you expect that can continue without additional support from the West? Because, of course, some of those support packages do appear to be faltering now.
Good morning. Thank you for the question. Let me start with the important beginning. Assistance of the international partners served as a key factor. We lost 1/3 of the GDP, and the most powerful migration flow surge since the Second World War, energy terror, and the full-scale war are still raging. So support of the international partners is indeed the key factor. Let me discuss another matter, though. Over my period as governor of National Bank of Ukraine, I would like to say that our economic resilience, our economic governance, it's not something that should be credited to one institution. This is our interplay between the National Bank and the government of Ukraine, its president, it's the Ukrainian business community. They all get credit for this. We realized a very important thing. Macro-financial stability is a mission, a goal, but an objective perhaps, but this is also our resource. And thanks to that, we can design a different system of our relations with IFIs. I remember when I started my tenure, that was the first week, my first week in the office, and we started our IMF negotiations and with the monitoring mission. The monitoring mission in October 2022 was supposed to verify that we were capable as an economy, as a government, as a Ukrainian authorities to work in the total uncertainty, such conditions, and to form the package of support for us to balance the economy at that point. IMF actually verified and confirmed all that. We had 120 billion hryvnias. That was the general package under the program with IMF, which started then in March. We've had 5 reviews since that. That's the farthest advancement of our relations with IMF. They would have at best 3 reviews in peacetime. Now we've had 5. And during the 5th, IMF pointed to high-quality governance, good governance, and interplay of the government with the business, an important point that we have to take care of. So our results should be shared. That's the result of our interplay and all our statements. And we never issue any unimportant statements. We always confirm that with action. In 2023, we announced that our strategic priority was to balance the budget, because it had to generate the risks and influence the resilience. And this year we are saying that we have to be better, do more. And this year, even in the unprecedented situation of this autumn and this winter, we'll succeed, I'm sure. Now, this is our interaction and clear understanding of the limits and limitations. We understand the lines of responsibility and our common perimeter of responsibility, the one that we share. Thank you very much.
Well, certainly I salute the Ukrainian government more widely for having kept the situation on track. When the International Monetary Fund have their annual meeting next month, is there anything that you would like from them in terms of help in keeping you stabilizing the currency and keeping the economy on track?
Of course, we hope, and we have achieved, we have the level of personnel we have achieved, reached the understanding. This opened the door for the next decision of the board, $1.1 billion being given to Ukraine as a result of that. This is the added value of the program in question. IMF, to some extent, serves as a verificator of the fact that our government, our state, implement one of the biggest and the most ambitious structural reform progress, in-depth reforms. And if you come to think of it, this is unprecedented. This is not just about troubleshooting, but this is about making structural changes for the future. Paving the way to Europe, we still adjust the legislation. We reform all the social, political, economic areas, just to name me any area which is not subjected to reform. Our candidacy agreement with the EU imposes a very ambitious plan indeed. So our interplay with IMF in the nearest month will present another tranche of funding. And I would like to support Prime Minister here. IMF program took into account at its baseline scenario revenues from the immobilized assets. And this is about actually forfeit of such assets. forfeiture of such effort. This forfeiture is now reviewed as something that can actually cover the financial toolkit presenting itself and become available for this year and for sure next year, because we have this political understanding and now with G7, and now we need some legal and financial consultations at the level of technical teams of the Ministry of Finance, central banks, but IMF during the fifth review included all those resources and their availability for next year as a token of assuredness, let's say, for our partners. And this is a totally different reality. This is a totally different consciousness. This and understanding. So our victory is not shapeless. Our victory has some financial parameters. Our victory of Ukraine will make this forfeiture possible as a source for covering for the losses and recovery of the resources that we so badly need today.
Yes, well, as you say, and one of the factors that has indeed supported the IMF program has been this assumption, really quite striking, that the proceeds from those frozen Russian assets will be used to help provide more economic stabilization, which is really quite a remarkable development. The IMF has made a number of fairly pioneering decisions around extending aid to Ukraine, and the issue of the Russian assets, of course, is quite unprecedented in many ways as well. But I'd like to turn to one of the other questions, which is hanging heavily over both the economy and the political landscape, which is the energy question. First of all, I'd like to clear up, Mr. Galushchenko, how much of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has already been knocked out? Because there were reports in the summer that Ukraine had lost about half of its energy infrastructure. Since then, some friends of mine have said, in fact, the figure is nearer to 75 or 80%. Which is correct? How much of the energy infrastructure has Ukraine now lost?
Thank you for the question. Well, in fact, we are talking here about losses in the energy sector that started in 2014. And in fact, those losses exceed 50%. If we take the totally destroyed assets and the assets we have in the occupied territories, unfortunately. So it's 9 gigawatts of capacity with the peak consumption last winter, 18. That's the half. And we are talking about losses of this year as a result of the attacks, big-scale attacks which started in March. And every day, every night, they target our energy sector. So 9 gigawatts, that's 50% of our peak consumption last winter. But of course, I cannot announce the figures as to what we do and how we do it to recover this the capacity for generation facing the winter. But we are doing that. Just take my word for it.
So one way to try to create more resilience would be to raise the energy imports from European Union. You've been importing about 1.7 gigawatts. How far do you think you can raise those imports? Can you get above 2, do you think, to try and fill that gap?
Yes, you're right. We would like to raise this gap up to 2.2 gigawatts in capacity. Recently, since the European Commission on Energy announced that the EU actually were approaching that.
In terms of looking at other options for boosting the energy infrastructure, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about building a more decentralized grid using green energy in the future. But in reality, that is going to take 2, 3, maybe even 4 years to actually put in place. How long do you think it's going to take to create a decentralized grid? And can that possibly help in any meaningful way this winter?
Unfortunately, this war, this situation, this continuous terror and impact for the energy infrastructure, 236, that was last time. Drones, rockets, missiles, ballistic missiles among them, employed by the enemy to hit our energy system. This is a challenge unheard of for this world. And so cogeneration is targeted, thermal generation. There are many things happening that make us proceed expediently with implementation of the plans that we designed as part of the energy strategy for Ukraine. And the timeline originally was up to 2035, 2040, 2050. That was our long-term planning for transformation of the energy system. Presently, those attacks, the impact, the destroyed assets make us speed up the process in implementation of our plans. And I would like to tell you that the energy blend, with green transformation included, unfortunately is also badly influenced by the war. But it is much better than with many European jurisdictions. It's 80% of carbonized energy, the highest. And we have to say that now we are making steps which were considered as formidable in peacetime and would take years, if not decades. And now I'm sure we will achieve that.
Do you have a rough price tag as to how much money is needed?
Well, there are different cost estimates, especially the assessment of the losses coming from the World Bank, billions of dollars, without any doubt. But, Zaporizhia PP is one example. When we calculate the losses, how can we assess that? Now, what's the value? About 40 billion US. And we do not know what's happening on the side. We will bring it back, but what will be the condition? How much investment will we need to bring it back into the grid? And after the barbarism that we now observe at the plant, the figures which I announced are quite relative in their essence.
Розподілу передачі електроенергії. Тому насправді це мова йде про, я думаю, десятки, а можливо навіть і сотні мільярдів в результаті будуть ті збитки, які заподіяні. Відповідно, нам треба все це відновити.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Chairman Stefanchuk and ask you, as Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, how is the energy situation hurting the morale, in your view, or is it hurting the morale of the people at the moment? And can you comment on the polls showing the decline of confidence and trust amongst the population in the cabinet? Because I totally understand the point the Prime Minister made, that actually the level of confidence in the government in Ukraine is higher than in the rest of the Western world. But the decline in confidence has been quite striking, and I'm curious how you see that from your perspective, representing the parliamentarians.
Thank you very much for your question. I think that the uniqueness of the Ukrainian situation is in the fact that on the 24th of February 2022, all the bodies of state power have acquired an absolutely new status. The president of Ukraine became the president of the country at war. Same happened to the parliament and to the government, and this is an absolutely different status. For more than 70 years, not a single country in Europe had such an experience. You can't read about this experience in your books, and you have to adopt decisions together with your colleagues about this. When the full-scale invasion started in 2022, when the top leaders of our country all remained in the country, I would like to remind you of the level of support then. The entire people of Ukraine have given quite an evaluation of this. This was for the first time in Ukraine's history. This had not happened in 1991 or 1918, and I think that it was then that the level of support for Ukrainian authorities was at the highest level. However, 2.5 years of war, of course, have their impact on what's happening in the country. However, I think that what the Prime Minister said, yes, this is a difficult period, and during such a difficult period, it is hard to have such indexes of support and trust, and I do think that this is very good in comparison to many countries of Europe. What we have to do, we have to honestly perform our jobs. When I'm talking about the Ukrainian parliament, I remember very well our first session, our first meeting, when at 7 a.m. MPs who are here, who are not here, have gathered at the building, in the building of the parliament, when they gathered to vote for martial law and to vote for economic decisions that could alleviate our situation. I remember this very well. I also remember how we were adopting the most complicated laws that allowed our country to become a candidate member of the European Union. I remember very well the very complicated decisions that the Ukrainian parliament had to adopt to provide for our defense capacity. I am honored to head such a parliament. The parliament composed of people who really care about the future of our country. I think that the final ratings will be allocated by history, and history will point to every person.
Certainly, it was absolutely dramatic what happened in the first few days of the invasion, and the demonstration of the commitment to democracy and democratic power, and the way the Verkhovna Rada rallied and came together in these very difficult conditions was truly striking and very commendable. But 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, one of the criticisms that is often said in Ukraine today is that there has been too much centralization of power and increasing quasi-authoritarian control over the media. Would you like to comment on that, given that the role of the Verkhovna Rada is to reflect the will of the people and to act as a check and balance on the president and the government?
You know, maybe it's easy for me, very easy to answer to this question, because the Ukrainian parliament has always been and will always be the basis for democracy in Ukraine. When I talk to my colleagues, I always say maybe the Ukrainian parliament is very hard to understand, because as the chairperson of the Verkhovna Rada, I do not have any people whom I command. They are not subordinated to me. I am first among the equals. But you raised the issue of centralization and media. Even despite such a complicated period of Ukraine, even despite the security measures we have decided to open the parliament to our media, and any accredited media can take part in covering the parliamentary activity. The MPs are using this, they are giving interviews within the parliament, we talk to the press. So from my side, I don't know if anyone can say that there's a pressure on media in the Ukrainian parliament. We are answering some very difficult questions, but of course the parliament has to explain what we are adopting. About the centralization and decentralization, I think that now the time has come, and maybe the situation is the same in the entire world, when the Constitution provides us an opportunity to limit rights and freedoms, but you have to take into account that we are fighting the country with a mad decentralization of power, where they cannot adopt any decision without the top confirmation. But you have a system of checks and balances in Ukraine, and I'm sure that this will contribute to our victory.
Right. Can I quickly, I'm going to turn to the question of corruption in a minute. Before I do, though, on the question of mobilization, there are estimates that another 500,000, 500,000 men will need to be mobilized. You're already seeing some resistance amongst the younger parts of the population towards mobilization. There are people fleeing overseas. There are people who are looking for ways to avoid mobilization. To what degree do you think the Verkhovna Rada supports the current framework for mobilization? And do you think there needs to be changes in how the mobilization is proceeding?
Of course. I think that the law on the amendments to the law of mobilization is maybe one of the most complicated laws adopted by the present convocation, because it pertains to every family. And when we were passing this law, we had to provide for every clause of this law to be just to everyone. Have we succeeded? I think mostly yes, but is it ideal? No, because it can't be ideal. And of course it has to provide for the rights of the warriors who are at the front, where just rotation is concerned, where financial and social stability has to be provided for, where we have to organize discussion about the future of Ukrainian warriors and veterans. Yesterday, when I was coming back from this conference, I was passing the site where wives and mothers of our prisoners are demonstrating with placards, and I stopped there and I talked about justice in this issue without any participation from the press. And we talked about the justice towards those people who are in captivity. We have already talked to the Prime Minister about this, and I think that something is already being done. The biggest thirst that Ukrainians have now is probably the thirst for justice. If we have justice, then Ukrainians will be able to win over everything. We will be able to withstand and get our victory. There's a lot of directions that we are looking at where mobilization is concerned. We're in discussion with the Ministry of Defense and other colleagues. However, I think that the result of this discussion should be the perfection and improvement of the law, so that the rights of every warrior who are sacrificing their lives and health now be protected.
Right, well, thank you. Well, I mean, one of the issues that does hang over to the mobilization question is the question of corruption. There are constant stories and rumors that the mobilization process is subject or influenced by corruption. Ukraine has made remarkable strides in seeking to overcome the corruption problem that has been a legacy of most of the former Soviet bloc. I'd like to turn now to Andriy Radina, who's head of the Anti-Corruption Committee of Parliament, to say, is there still corruption in Ukraine and in the mobilization process? And what are you doing to try and convince both the voters in Ukraine and the wider world that you can actually start to root it out? Because certainly, you know, the reports among some foreign observers is that the corruption situation is not improving. If anything, it's getting worse at the moment. So tell me what you think is the current situation and what you're doing.
Dear distinguished ladies and gentlemen, so as my position implies, I would not be saying nice things only, but I will start with nice things. I think in the past 2 years, we actually managed to persuade partners that we are doing a lot to root out corruption. We took some very serious action, and results of this action has been recognized by European Union in the decision to grant candidate status and to open membership negotiations with Ukraine. Our efforts in rooting out corruption has been recognized by independent international organizations, and for example, our standing in the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International, which is improving. I think that the seriousness of Ukraine's fight against corruption has also been recognized by, for example, more than 170 people who have actually been decided guilty for corruption offenses, and half of them literally went to jail to serve their time in prison. Hundreds more public officials are now under investigation or facing trial for high-profile corruption, and I think these people are also starting to recognize the seriousness of the effort. I also hope that, for example, officials of State Bureau of Investigations, the institution that has long been complained of pressuring businesses and whom we recently legislated to fully reshuffle, I think these officials hopefully also start to recognize the seriousness of our effort to root out corruption. But, and to nice things, sorry, whom we did not manage to persuade yet are unfortunately people and businesses of Ukraine. Because public opinion polls do show us, and we have to recognize this and take ownership in that, about 56% of the population still think that corruption is a major problem. And businesses in Ukraine, unfortunately, still sometimes complain of being pressured by law enforcement. And this is why many businesses decide to not engage in, for example, public procurement and to not deal with the state, and therefore leave the business of, for example, public procurement to sometimes questionable companies who hope to receive backing from prosecutors, while some prosecutors still do get fabulously rich while being tucked away from public eye. So unfortunately, this still happens. So what do we do? What do we do politically, and what are we doing? The choice basically is simple. We either try to persuade people that people are wrong and all has been done, and I personally do not recommend this way because I just don't think that it is physically safe to have this kind of conversation with people out there in the streets. So again, do not recommend this. I think, and I take this very seriously on my position, that our job as a government and as a parliamentarians is to not persuade people that they are wrong, but not to postpone all the action necessary to root out corruption for after the victory, and take the steps very seriously now. Because it is our job as a government to win support of the people, since we as a government and basically society at large expects people to, yes, sacrifice the most important things that they have, their lives, and it is our job to win their trust back. So, good things, again, we are working on that. Customs reform. Hopefully we will be able to adopt that in a second hearing in the parliament in coming weeks. And this customs reform, hopefully, is a very serious thing with full independence for heads of customs and mandate to actually do the serious job. Full transparency of costs in public construction procurement. Also, hopefully, we will be able to adopt a legislation on that in the parliament next week. But this is not only a job for the parliament, this is also a job for law enforcement. While some law enforcement, like National Anti-Corruption Bureau, doubles the number of notification of suspicions they serve, some prosecutors, for example, are still not brought to liability for allegations for pressuring businesses, so this has to happen. All the people guilty in obstructing justice, all the people guilty of, or I would even say, frankly, suspected in pressuring businesses, they all need to go, and any obstruction of justice, any obstruction of competition with dealing with the state and public funds, this also has to be very seriously rooted out now, not waiting before the end of the war.
Right, well, thank you. Yes, Central Bank Governor, please. Governor Pyshnyy.
I'd like to say just a few words. This is not my department, but I'm one of the 4 people who signs memoranda with the IMF, and I am present at all the discussions related to the fight against corruption. What is the value of our program of cooperation with IMF? It makes it possible for us to monitor the dynamics. If that work in Ukraine was not successful, we would not have gone through the first monitoring by IMF with success. Now we are at the 5th stage of negotiations with the IMF, and every time the IMF says that we've successfully reached indicative benchmarks. And at the core of them is the anti-corruption endeavor. Of course, we all would like to have more, but one way or another, the dynamics are here. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a program with the IMF to begin with. This is another value of this program. It drives the process forward and verifies the outcome. So the dynamics are here, and let's remember about that.
No, absolutely. Well, I think you make a very important point, Governor Pyshnyy, because, of course, the IMF and the European Union have commended the degree to which Ukraine has acknowledged the corruption problem and the degree to which groups like the Verkhovna Rada are seeking to introduce legislation to clamp down on it. And yet, of course, the polls show that many Ukrainian citizens continue, as you said, to be very concerned about this. But we haven't got much more time here, and I would like to bring in Roxolana Pytlasa, who's also part of the Verkhovna Rada, in charge of the Budget Committee. I'd like to just quickly ask you, if you are in the room, I can't see. All right, I'm sorry. I'd like to ask you quickly, from your perspective, as you look ahead over the next year, how do you assess the current state of the budget? Obviously, the majority of the expenditures are going on the military support. And are you assuming that you will get the proceeds from the frozen Russian assets to keep the budget on track? And if you don't, what will happen?
Thank you for this question. I will try to be very succinct, and we gathered here today on Saturday morning to talk about internal challenges that are faced by Ukraine in different spheres. And of course, it is important to elaborate on financial challenges that Ukraine is faced, because this year, one day of war for Ukraine costs roughly $140 million one day, apart from in-kind military support that is received by Ukraine from Western countries. And I'm not sure that people abroad realize that this cost is borne by Ukraine alone. We're not allowed to use any Western direct budget support for soldiers' salaries, for military production, and even for medical help to the wounded on the front line. In 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, government expenditures doubled overnight. At the same time, the economy shrank 30%, and it created an enormous gap that still exists after almost 3 years of the full-scale war. And this gap is not just statistics, it's Ukrainian people. It's IDPs who receive housing support from the government. It's teachers and doctors. It's rebuilding of schools and hospitals in Ukraine that were destroyed by Russian shelling. And of course, international community stepped in. We have received almost $100 billion from the start of the full-scale invasion in non-military support. And we will be eternally grateful for this help in the times of the greatest need. But yesterday, the government of Ukraine voted on the budget of 2025 to be submitted to the parliament and considered in the parliament. The need for external financing for 2025 is $38.4 billion. Presently, the IMF and the EU have committed to providing a little bit more than $15 billion, leaving us with uncovered budget deficit of $23 billion. Now, I usually have a very ungrateful job to ask for money, but I do believe personally that every dollar of non-military support that Ukraine receives frees $1 of our taxpayers' money that we could use for fighting Russia. That is why I call for everyone in this room who could influence the situation of speeding up the process of approving the mechanisms for disbursing $50 billion package from the frozen Russian assets to step in and do so. Because unfortunately, and I have to say about this, after loud political announcement that happened at G7 summit, we do not see many practical steps being taken in this regard. And the process of developing the mechanism for disbursing money is frankly stalling at the moment. And it is vitally important for Ukraine to have this mechanism to be approved by the end of the year, because we will start January with the need to finance all our non-military expenditures. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that comment, and it seems like a good moment to end on because it shows both the ability of the Ukrainian leadership to get itself organized and to have a clear-cut plan for how they want to go forward in tackling the challenges, and the very practical ways that the outside world can actually support.